Welcome to chapter 4 of Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. It deals with a strange subject today, the subject of hate. And he says in times of war, in particular, hate becomes a respectable thing, even though it has to masquerade under the guise of patriotism. Talked about the level of color hatred after Pearl Harbor incident. Hatred was brought out into the open, given a formal dignity, he says, and responsibility. Christianity has been almost sentimental in its effort to deal with hatred in human life. It has sought to get rid of it through preaching, by moralizing, and through platitudes, judgments. It's become a subject that is, for the most part, taboo. He says hatred cannot be defined, it can only be described. What an interesting thought, I said. But he begins to give what he calls an anatomy of hatred. He does it in 4 different ways. In the first place, he says, hatred begins in a situation in which there is contact without fellowship, contact without the elements of warmth and feelings. This is the type of fellowship, he says, you find in the South between black and white people, especially during the 30s and the 40s, and even earlier than that. Much of modern life is so impersonal, he says, that there is always opportunity for the seeds of hatred to grow unmolested. That's the first place. Hatred begins in a situation in which there is contact between people, but no fellowship. In second place, he says, hatred is contact without fellowship, and it tends to express itself in the kind of understanding that is strikingly unsympathetic, he says. There is no sense of understanding or personhood. Unsympathetic understanding is the characteristic attitude governing the relation between the weak and the strong. Thurman says when white people in the South say they understand the Negro, they really mean that they have a knowledge of the Negro within the limitations of the boundaries in which white man has set up. The kind of Negro he understands has no existence except in his own mind. That breeds hatred. In third place, he says, an unsympathetic understanding tends to express itself in the active functioning of ill will. It is on purpose. And in the fourth place, he says, and I'll dramatize it in a way in the last chapter when it really deals with the notion of love. But in the first place, he's when hatred is dramatized in a human being, it becomes hatred walking on the earth, he says. The outline becomes pure and simple: contact without fellowship, developing hatred, and expressing themselves in unsympathetic understanding, and unsympathetic understanding tending to express itself in the exercise of ill will, and ill will dramatized in a man or woman, becoming hatred walking on the earth. So he says in the fourth place, the way you see hatred is through ill will, someone deliberately having an ill will towards another person, and it is acted out in a human being. And he says that's hatred walking on the earth. Hatred has a tendency, he says, to spread even to the disinherited. Thurman says hatred in the mind and spirit of the disinherited is born out of bitterness, a bitterness that is made possible by sustained resentment, which is bottled up until it distills an essence of vitality given to the individual in whom this is happening. It's really sad. For the disinherited, he says, they look out upon the world. They recognize that they are the victims of a systematic denial of rights and privileges that are theirs. And by virtue of both, of their being human beings and of their citizenship, they are denied this. So hatred becomes a device by which the disinherited individual seeks to protect themselves against moral disintegration. It's not difficult to see how hatred operating in this fashion provides for the weak a basis for moral justification. For the disinherited, he says, it is clear then that for the weak, hatred seems to serve a creative purpose. But Jesus had some understanding of this apparent contradiction, because what passed through Jesus's mind, you ask, when he observed the contempt for the Jews by the Romans. In the face of an environment of hatred, he encountered, Jesus says, love your enemies, that you may be children of your Father, which is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise, he says, on the evil and on the just, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. Why? Because hatred destroys the very core of life within an individual. Hatred bears deadly and bitter fruit. Howard says this is what Jesus' thought is on the whole subject. And when it is released, when hatred is released, it is not confined only to the sender, but it is blind and non-discriminatory. The logic of the development of hatred is death to the spirit and destruction of moral values. Jesus did not come to justify hate coming from the disinherited or the oppressor. Jesus rejected hatred, understanding the environment of the weak. He rejected it because he saw that hatred meant death to the mind, death to the spirit, death to communion with the Father. And he affirmed life. And hatred was the great denial of life. Jesus rejected hate in its fullest sense. And so must we. So Howard says, in spite of the fact that hatred is real, that in the mind of Christ, who was hated, he died. But in his mind still, he says, love your enemy. I'll see you in the next chapter.